Okay, hello everybody. I'm excited to have the opportunity today to talk to you about U.S. agriculture and the Green New Deal. So I'm not going to go too deeply into the Green New Deal, as I'm sure most of you are at least broadly familiar with it, but I will start by just the outlines here. The idea is that the Green New Deal, which is of course an open-ended and contested political platform, but that it would move the US to net zero carbon emissions while also securing a fair and just transition for all workers and communities. Of course, exactly what this means and what it looks like, again, is open to debate. And but it has really created a lot of it's gotten a lot of attention. Lots of proponents, but also, of course, lots of backlash to this project. One of the reasons, of course, is that it challenges the power of the fossil fuel industry. But what I want to talk about today is how any Green New Deal to achieve these two goals would ultimately require redesigning the agri-food system in the US and even globally. And this is something that hasn't gotten adequate attention. So what I want to do is talk about the politics of this. Of course, the Green New Deal harkens back to the 1930s New Deal under FDR during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era. And there's lots of attention has been paid to this connection and to particularly the way that the New Deal has had plenty of shortcomings. For instance, its racial and gender exclusions, but also to the strengths of the New Deal and the potential for the revival of some sort of Green New Deal. One of the strengths of the original New Deal was that it mobilized state resources for both to address social and environmental problems, right? So a host of problems ranging from the ecological problems of the Dust Bowl and soil erosion, which was, the sort of major issue at the time, as well as the related social issues of unemployment, declining stagnant wages, and all of the other things that we know were prevalent during the Great Depression. So a lot of people are pointing out that many of these that we need something similar today to address both the social and the ecological challenges that we are facing and to recognize them as interconnected, right? That any sort of policy that just addresses one side of that is doomed to failure. So while it might have been the sort of great ecological and social challenge of the 1930s might have been the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, today, it's similar kinds of economic crises in terms of 2008 crash, 2020 COVID economic crises, as well as the issue of climate change. And people are also pointing out, those that study the sort of political history and economic history of the US, that we are also returning to the same levels of wealth inequality that we saw immediately prior to and during the Great Depression, as this graph shows very dramatically here. So these are all some of the reasons why people are arguing that something like the Green New Deal is necessary. And these levels of inequality, I would like to stress today, are manifest not just in income inequality, but also in land inequality. And that is what I want to talk about in terms of US agriculture. So for instance, between 2008 and 2017, the median holdings of the top 100 US landowners grew dramatically from approximately 160,000 acres to 250,000 acres. And of course, here on the right, we see Ted Turner, well known as a sort of land baron of today. Also, the wealthiest 1% of US households own 40% of land value. Okay, the top 10% owns a whopping 85% of land value, according to a paper by Wolf in 2016. So these are just some very broad ways to think about inequalities as they manifest in control over land. This is also, of course, racialized in the US. The top 5 landowners are all white and own more acreage than all of Black America combined. And 98% of agricultural land is white owned. Similarly, native reservations are held in trust by the federal government, and they are subject to fossil fuel extraction for corporate profit. This is, of course, something that indigenous movements have been challenging for a long time. Nonetheless, this inequality remains. Okay, so we can learn about this group, the National Coalition for Land Reform, which formed in the 1970s, I think can tell us a lot about the potential for addressing these kinds of land inequalities today. This is a group that's not very well known, but actually has some really relevant ideas, I think. And it's also important to recognize that they too were drawing on the lessons of the original New Deal at a time when the New Deal coalition was actually being challenged and ultimately broken apart in the 1970s by the rise of what we today term neoliberalism. Okay, so the National Coalition for Land Reform came together in the 1970s as a group of US scholars, farm organizations, small farm organizations, environmental groups, to argue against the takeover by wealthy outside interests of land and resources that should belong to the people. Quoting from some of their documents, they argued that farmers, farm workers, environmentalists, whites, blacks, Chicanos, and Indians must join together in the struggle. So they, again, using the language of the people, were arguing against corporate and elite monopolization of land and the way that that played out for a host of people. And to them, this issue of land control connected economic inequality and environmental exploitation, right? So they really highlighted the centrality of land control to social and economic issues. One book which I've used to sort of recreate their vision and their politics is this edited collection called The People's Land. And in it, they argue that with 3 out of 4 Americans now jammed into cities, no one pays much attention to landholding patterns in the countryside. And this is, again, something that sort of agri-food system thinkers are emphasizing again today, that, you know, the sort of disconnection from people's disconnection, consumers' disconnections from where they get their food has led to a kind of obfuscation of the problems of land concentration in the countryside. And they offered a very explicitly sort of left or redistributive version of populism. And by populism here, I know this is a kind of contested term, but what I mean by populism here is simply using the rhetoric of the people, and you know, a sort of current manifestations of that include sort of thinking about the 99%, right? So that is a kind of left populism. Of course, there are also right versions of populism where the people is not figured as the 99% or those who are excluded from economic, social, political rights, but actually where the people are understood narrowly in exclusive terms as a particular class of citizen. So it is a interesting and important, I think, to think about the various kinds of populism, but the NCLR offered an explicitly left populism. We see here Robert Brown, the founder of the Emergency Land Fund, and Kurt Kickingbird and Karen Duchesneau, both indigenous authors, contributed to this framing, and they argued that the deterioration of our cities have their roots in the land, or more precisely in the lack of access to productive land ownership by the poor, the young, and the non-white, by the people. So the principles that they codified during their sort of first national conference in San Francisco in 1973, there's a long list of principles, but there were a couple that I want to highlight here. First, that land is a precious and finite resource and the birthright of the people. Its ownership and control and the associated economic and political power must be widely distributed. And of course, again, they are pointing out how land ownership and political power has been overly concentrated, taken away from the people. And again, they emphasize the sort of multiracial working class dimensions of this political platform, arguing that Indians and Hispanic Americans with historic claims, along with low-income people generally, should benefit from the challenges to land concentration. Of course, today, we can see this again in many ways. The sort of most obvious example of this is the sort of giveaways of public land to the fossil fuel industry that keep the current carbon economy running. And again, as I stressed at the beginning, any sort of effort to transition in a just way to a sustainable economy is going to require reshaping of US agriculture away from sort of large scale industrial, chemical intensive, carbon intensive, monoculture industrial production, and towards a more diversified, small scale and sustainable uses. And that's not going to happen without changes to the political and economic context of land ownership. So there are a couple of other things that are important to note. It's not just farmers, though, that have some interest in this issue. As I mentioned earlier, of course, indigenous movements for land restitution are vital and have only continued to grow and strengthen their alliance with climate activists since the Dakota Access Pipeline protest of 2016. Again, so what I'm trying to highlight here is the political alliances that are emerging that could all center around land, the politics of land for social and ecological justice. So in addition to small-scale farmers, to indigenous movements, we also have the growth of a new generation of American farmers, as this Greenhorns publication refers to it. Younger folks who are wanting to get into small-scale, sustainable agriculture. And of course, one of the largest barriers to these aspiring farmers is land access. And beyond these movements, you also have urban movements, for instance, against gentrification and for urban agriculture that are challenging also existing land tenure patterns and processes and policies. Everything ranging from community land trust to more informal actions, for instance, squatting on vacant land and starting community gardens, all these kinds of things, we see this variety of interest groups and communities who are challenging the current state of land ownership and land tenure and land use in the US. So how did the NCLR try to, how did they suggest that changes be made? They actually had, in addition to the sort of broad principles, they also had a pretty well-developed plan for how to reshape land justice. And I don't want to get too deep into that now because we don't have the time, but again, there are more details in this book, and it's a really interesting plan. So they first proposed starting a national land trust fund and naming it this to avoid pushback against the concept of land reform. And this land trust fund would provide a mechanism for the redistribution of land and power away from corporate and absentee owners to popular control. But it was not a sort of government seizure of land and redistribution, which of course would see immense pushback in the US of the 21st century, and it would have in the 1970s as well. This fund it was a kind of a carrot and stick approach. The fund would collect revenue from a federal severance tax on the extraction of fossil fuels, as well as an unearned increment tax on property owners. This unearned increment tax, for instance, would be used to challenge and lower the role of speculation, of speculative real estate investment. And of course, the federal severance tax on fossil fuels both encourages a faster shift to renewable energies, as well as funding these programs, which would facilitate a new vision of land in the US. So these are the two sources of funds. Again, they are simple changes to the tax code. Of course, it gets more complicated, but this is not an insurmountable technical issue. The trust would then distribute funds to support a just transition. So this could be to low income and sustainable agriculture cooperatives, towards indigenous land restitution, towards regional renewable energy infrastructure, towards Black land loss organizations, migrant farm worker housing and support, community development cooperatives, local land trust, all kinds of local and regional organizations aligning with the principles of the National Coalition for Land Reform. So this was their sort of vision. And of course, things would, the 21st century context is a little different, but actually not so different that this NCLR plan it would be irrelevant. It actually seems to be a pretty workable, broad outline, just depending on the political will, right? This is not a massive technical issue, but more actually a question of political will. So I just want to conclude then by pointing out the need to think about how US agricultural politics and the future of US agriculture is connected to these issues of land politics, and how the Green New Deal must incorporate attention to rural land issues and to the agri-food system in general very explicitly if it has a chance of succeeding. I should also point out that these are issues faced around the world, and that those thinking about this in the US should also understand this in a global context, that challenging land monopolization is necessary to deal with current social and ecological crises. So I'll just close here with a few references that I cited earlier in case anyone wants them, and appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.